The mist clung to the cemetery like a shroud, wrapping around weathered tombstones and muffling the distant sounds of the city. James had been digging graves for 20 years, finding peace in the quiet company of the departed. Today, however, the silence was broken by a suited figure standing alone at a fresh grave, reading aloud from legal papers. James paused, leaning on his shovel, watching the lawyer's lips move in solemn recitation. Then suddenly, the man's voice faltered. His head snapped up, eyes locking directly with James's across the distance between them. The paper trembled in the lawyer's hand. Don't forget to subscribe to hear what happens next in this tale of unexpected connections. The lawyer's gaze lingered on James for what felt like an eternity before he carefully folded the papers and approached with measured steps across the damp grass. James straightened his weathered frame, brushing dirt from hands that had become calloused and strong over 2 decades of grave digging. At 47, his once dark hair now carried streaks of gray, much like the granite headstones surrounding him. The cemetery had become more home than the empty apartment he returned to each night. "You're James Mercer, aren't you?" the lawyer asked, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of his profession. James nodded, surprised to be recognized. Most people looked through gravediggers, not at them. They were fixtures of the cemetery, like the iron gates or stone angels, necessary but best kept invisible. "I'm Richard Harmon, representing the estate of Eleanor Winters," the lawyer continued, gesturing toward the fresh grave. The name struck James like a physical blow. Eleanor Winters. He hadn't known her name until now, but he knew her face. For 3 years, she had visited her husband's grave every Sunday, always nodding politely to James, sometimes bringing an extra coffee that she'd leave on the groundskeeper's shed without a word. "Mrs. Winters made specific provisions in her will regarding you," Richard said, consulting his papers again. A sharp laugh interrupted them. James turned to see the cemetery manager, Victor Crane, approaching with his perpetual scowl. What business would old Eleanor have with him? Victor sneered. "He's just the digger. Barely speaks to anyone." James felt the familiar sting of dismissal. Victor had always treated the groundskeeping staff as beneath notice, especially James, who'd taken this job after his construction company collapsed during the recession, along with his marriage and sense of worth. "Actually," Richard replied coolly, "Mrs. Winters was quite specific. She left instructions and a substantial bequest for Mr. Mercer." Victor's face contorted with disbelief. "That's absurd. What could she possibly?" "Perhaps," Richard interrupted, "you'd prefer to discuss this privately." He turned to James, whose heart hammered against his ribs. "There's something Mrs. Winters wanted you to know. Something about kindness remembered, and a promise she made to her husband about you." James followed Richard to a small stone bench beneath an old oak tree, away from Victor's prying ears. The lawyer sat down and opened his briefcase, extracting a sealed envelope along with the legal documents. "Before I explain Mrs. Winters' bequest, I should tell you that Victor has filed a formal complaint challenging the will," Richard said quietly. "He believes any cemetery funds should go to management, not staff." James felt his stomach tighten. Of course Victor would try to interfere. What did Mrs. Winters want? "She left you the deed to a small cottage on the edge of town. It was her husband's childhood home." Richard handed him a photograph of a modest stone house surrounded by wildflowers. "And a trust fund for its maintenance." Before James could process this information, Victor's voice boomed behind them. "This is completely inappropriate, Harmon. You can't conduct private business on cemetery grounds." Richard stood, maintaining his professional composure. "We're nearly finished, Mr. Crane." "No, you're finished now." Victor turned to James, his voice dripping with contempt. "Back to work, Mercer. Those graves won't dig themselves." James felt the familiar heat of shame creep up his neck as he rose from the bench. 20 years of dignity stripped away with a few casual words. "Actually," Richard interjected, "as Mrs. Winters' executor, I need a few more minutes of Mr. Mercer's time." Victor stepped closer, towering over James. "Listen carefully, Mercer. Your shift ends at 5. Every minute you spend chatting instead of working comes out of your paycheck." He smiled coldly. "Unless you prefer I find someone more dedicated to replace you." James looked down at his dirt-stained boots. At 57, with no formal education and a gap-filled resume, finding another job would be nearly impossible. He nodded silently and turned back toward his unfinished work. "We can continue this discussion after your shift," Richard called after him. The following morning, James arrived to find his equipment shed padlocked. Victor stood nearby with two board members of the cemetery association. "Ah, Mercer. We're conducting an inventory of all cemetery property," Victor announced loudly. "Seems some tools have gone missing recently." James felt his colleague's eyes on him. "I've never taken anything," he said quietly. "No one's accusing you," Victor replied with mock sincerity. "Yet. But until we complete our audit, you'll need to sign out any equipment you use. Through me, personally." By lunchtime, James had lost 2 hours waiting for Victor to find time to unlock the shed. When he finally returned to Eleanor's grave to finish his work, he found Victor speaking with an elderly woman. "Mrs. Blackwood, this is James Mercer," Victor said smoothly. "The man I mentioned." The woman regarded James with suspicion. "You're the one Eleanor Winters left property to. You barely knew her." James began. "Mrs. Blackwood is Eleanor's cousin," Victor interrupted. "She finds it strange that a distant acquaintance would receive such generosity when family was overlooked." "Very strange indeed," Mrs. Blackwood sniffed, almost as if undue influence was exerted. James stood silently, dirt caking his hands, aware of how he must appear to this well-dressed woman. What defense could he offer? As they walked away, Richard approached, having witnessed the exchange. "Don't let them intimidate you," he said quietly. Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. James straightened slightly. "Did you know I was an architectural draftsman before the recession?" he asked unexpectedly. "I designed custom homes for 15 years. Richard looked surprised. "No, I didn't." James nodded toward the photo of the cottage still in Richard's hand. "That's why she chose me. I restored that cottage for her husband 30 years ago." She remembered. A silver-haired woman in an expensive suit watched from her black Mercedes. Margaret Winters, Eleanor's sister and cemetery board president, tapped her manicured fingers against the steering wheel. "Interesting," she murmured, reaching for her phone. "Very interesting indeed." The morning air hung heavy with dew as James arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of Eleanor's cottage and Victor's thinly veiled threats. The padlock on the equipment shed gleamed mockingly in the pale light. He wouldn't bother asking for access today. Instead, James reached into his weathered backpack and pulled out a small leather case. Inside lay drafting tools he hadn't touched in years, a compass, mechanical pencils, and a metal ruler that still bore the logo of his former architectural firm. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded a blank sheet of paper he'd purchased at the convenience store on his way in. Finding a flat headstone to work on, James began sketching from memory. The cottage in the photograph had stayed with him all these years, its distinctive roofline, the proportions of the windows, the stone chimney that he'd insisted needed to be rebuilt properly. As his pencil moved across the paper, years seemed to fall away. This was what he'd been born to do. "What are you doing?" The voice startled him. Richard stood a few feet away, coffee cup in hand, briefcase tucked under his arm. "Something I should have done years ago," James replied, not looking up from his drawing. "Remembering who I am." Richard stepped closer, watching as James's hands moved with surprising precision across the paper. "That's remarkable," he said after a moment. "You're recreating the cottage from memory." "With some improvements," James nodded. "The original had structural issues I'd fix now. See this support beam? It should have been reinforced here and here." His pencil tapped specific points on the drawing. "And the drainage around the foundation was always problematic." Richard studied the detailed sketch with newfound respect. "You weren't exaggerating about your background." "No," James said simply. "I wasn't." By mid-morning, James had completed 3 detailed drawings, the cottage as it was, structural improvements he would recommend, and a third showing potential expansions that maintained the original character. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice Victor approaching until the man's shadow fell across his paper. "Taking up art during work hours, Mercer?" Victor's voice dripped with sarcasm. "How creative. And how convenient that you found a way around the equipment restrictions." James carefully set down his pencil. "Just documenting some memories of Mrs. Winters' property." Victor snatched one of the drawings. "Playing architect now. This is pathetic." He examined the paper more closely, his expression shifting subtly. "Where did you get these specifications from?" "My head," James replied quietly. "I designed the original renovation 30 years ago." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Impossible. Those plans were drawn up by Harrington and Associates. I've seen the documentation." "Harrington was the firm I worked for," James said, standing slowly. My name is on the original blueprints as lead draftsman. Page 3, bottom right corner. For a moment, Victor's composure slipped. You're lying. Am I? James reached for his backpack again and pulled out a faded business card. James Mercer, architectural designer, Harrington and Associates. Eleanor kept it all these years. It was in the envelope with her letter. Richard stepped forward. That's quite interesting, considering the petition you filed yesterday, Mr. Chambers. Victor's head snapped toward the lawyer. What are you talking about? The petition challenging Mrs. Winters' bequest on the grounds that Mr. Mercer had no prior connection to the deceased. Richard smiled thinly. I received notice this morning. Fascinating timing. This changes nothing, Victor hissed. A business card proves nothing. And even if he did draw up some plans decades ago, it hardly justifies leaving valuable property to he gestured dismissively at James's dirt-stained clothes, a gravedigger. James gathered his drawings calmly. Mrs. Winters didn't leave the cottage to a gravedigger. She left it to the man who helped create her husband's dream home. The man who spent hours discussing proper joinery techniques with Thomas Winters while they shared lunch on that very property. A few cemetery workers had stopped to listen, drawn by the tension in Victor's voice. You know what I find interesting? James continued, his voice gaining strength. You claim to have seen documentation from Harrington and Associates, yet you're surprised by my connection to the firm. Why would you have been reviewing 30-year-old architectural plans for a property that, until recently, wasn't even part of the cemetery's expansion? Victor's face flushed. As cemetery director, I review all adjacent properties, including private residences not for sale. Richard asked innocently. That seems beyond the scope of your position. I don't have to justify myself to either of you, Victor snapped. Mercer, get back to work or clear out your locker. James nodded toward the locked equipment shed. With what tools, exactly? A sleek black Mercedes pulled up on the cemetery's main drive. Margaret Winters emerged, her silver hair catching the morning light. She walked purposefully toward the small gathering, her heels clicking on the paved path. Mr. Chambers, she called. A word, please. Victor's demeanor instantly changed. Mrs. Winters, I was just explaining to. I heard quite clearly what you were explaining, Margaret interrupted. From several yards away, in fact. She turned to James. Mr. Mercer, isn't it? My sister mentioned you in our last conversation. James nodded respectfully. Man. Margaret glanced at the drawings in his hands. May I? Hesitantly, James handed them over. Margaret examined each one carefully, her expression unreadable. Thomas loved that cottage, she said finally. Eleanor told me how he would spend hours discussing the renovation with the young architect who understood his vision. She looked up at James. She said you were the only one who saw the potential in that dilapidated building. It had good bones, James said simply. Margaret handed the drawings back. Yes, Eleanor used those exact words. She turned to Victor. Mr. Chambers, I'd like to see you in my office in 1 hour. And please bring the expansion proposals you've been working on. Her tone left no room for argument. Victor's face had gone pale. Of course, Mrs. Winters. As Margaret walked away, she paused beside James. My sister was an excellent judge of character, Mr. Mercer. She rarely made mistakes about people. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Victor. Rarely. After Margaret and Victor had departed, Richard chuckled softly. I wouldn't want to be in his shoes right now. James carefully returned his drafting tools to their case. What happens now? Now, Richard said, we proceed with the reading of the will as planned. But I suspect Mr. Chambers' objections may suddenly be withdrawn. He hesitated. There's something else you should know. The cottage property isn't just a sentimental gift. The land it sits on has become quite valuable. The Cemetery Association has been trying to acquire it for years. James looked up in surprise. Eleanor never mentioned that. She wouldn't have, Richard replied. She enjoyed keeping Victor Chambers in his place. Much like her sister does. He gestured toward the retreating figure of Margaret Winters. I have a feeling you've just gained a powerful ally. That afternoon, James found the equipment shed unlocked, with a new set of premium gardening tools inside and a note that simply read, for Mr. Mercer's use only. M.W. He smiled as he selected what he needed to properly finish Eleanor's grave. As he worked, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he wasn't just the cemetery's gravedigger. He was James Mercer, architectural designer, a man with skills and knowledge that couldn't be buried under years of dirt and dismissal. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the headstones, James stood back to admire his work on Eleanor's grave. The border of white roses looked perfect against the freshly turned earth. "Thank you," he whispered to the quiet grave, "for remembering who I was when I'd forgotten. What's your story? I'd love to know where you're watching from and if you've ever had someone believe in you when others didn't. Comment below and let me know what part of the world you're tuning in from." The next morning, James found an envelope tucked beneath his shed door. Inside was a photograph, him and Eleanor in the cottage garden, and a note, "I know what really happened the night Thomas died. Meet me, or Margaret sees everything." James stared at the note, his hands trembling. The photograph showed him and Eleanor in the cottage garden, their heads bent close in conversation. Nothing incriminating, but the implication was clear. Someone knew something, or thought they did, about Thomas's death. He tucked the note into his pocket and tried to focus on his work, but his mind raced with possibilities. Who could have sent it? Victor Chambers seemed the obvious suspect, but James couldn't be certain. As dusk fell, James made his way to the cottage. If someone wanted to meet him, that's where they'd expect him to be. The gravel path crunched beneath his boots as he approached the small stone building nestled among ancient oaks. Eleanor had loved this place, had fought to preserve it when the cemetery board wanted to demolish it for expansion. The cottage door was unlocked. James hesitated before pushing it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was still and musty. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "I wasn't sure you'd come." James spun around. A figure emerged from the shadows, Sarah Winters, Eleanor's niece and Margaret's daughter. "Sarah, you sent the note." She stepped forward, her face half illuminated by moonlight. "I found the photograph in Aunt Eleanor's things. Mother asked me to sort through her personal items." "What do you think you know about Thomas's death?" James asked carefully. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I know Aunt Eleanor was with you that night, not at home like she claimed. I know Uncle Thomas died alone." James felt a chill run through him. "It wasn't what you think. Then what was it?" Sarah demanded. "Because it looks like my aunt was having an affair with the cemetery's gravedigger while her husband died. We were working on designs for the cottage renovation," James said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Thomas knew we were meeting. He encouraged it." Sarah scoffed. "And I'm supposed to believe that?" "It's the truth." James moved to the old desk in the corner and pulled out a drawer. Eleanor kept everything. He extracted a folder of sketches and notes, dated the night Thomas died. "We were here, working. Thomas called Eleanor's cell phone around 9, said he wasn't feeling well. She left immediately. But she was too late," Sarah said softly. James nodded. "The heart attack was sudden. The doctor said even if she'd been home, she couldn't have saved him." Sarah took the folder, examining the papers. Why lie about where she was? The board was looking for reasons to remove her as trustee. Victor Chambers especially. If they knew she was meeting privately with an employee, they'd use it against her, Sarah finished. "And against you. Eleanor protected me. She knew what this job meant to me, especially after I lost my license." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "The malpractice suit. Mother told me." "It wasn't malpractice," James said quietly. "It was a mistake in judgment that cost me everything." The cottage door suddenly burst open. Victor Chambers stood in the doorway, a triumphant smile on his face. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he said, stepping inside. "Secret meetings in the dark. Just like old times, Mercer." James stiffened. "What do you want, Victor?" "I want what's rightfully mine." Victor's gaze shifted to Sarah. "Miss Winters, I'm surprised to find you here. What would your mother think?" "My mother would think I'm exactly where I need to be," Sarah replied coolly. Victor chuckled. "Bold words. But will she feel the same when she learns her sister was carrying on with the help while her husband died alone?" "That's not what happened," James said. "It doesn't matter what happened," Victor snapped. "It matters what people believe happened. And when the board hears about this, they'll hear the truth," came a voice from the doorway. Margaret Winters stepped into the cottage, her imposing figure silhouetted against the night sky. Richard Harmon followed close behind. Victor's smile faltered. "Margaret, I was just explaining to your daughter." "I heard what you were explaining," Margaret interrupted. "And I've heard enough." She turned to James. "Mr. Mercer, my sister left a sealed letter with Richard, to be opened only if questions arose about the night Thomas died." Richard stepped forward, holding an envelope. Eleanor anticipated that someone might try to use that night against you, James. Open it, Margaret instructed. Richard broke the seal and unfolded the letter. If you're reading this, he read, then someone has discovered that James Mercer and I were meeting at the cottage the night Thomas died. What they won't know is that Thomas arranged these meetings himself. Victor's face darkened as Richard continued reading. Thomas knew his heart was failing. He wanted the cottage restored before he died, as a gift to me. James was helping us in secret because Victor Chambers had blocked every official attempt to preserve the property. Thomas died knowing his wishes would be carried out by someone he trusted. Margaret took the letter from Richard. My sister concludes by naming James as the rightful architect for the cottage restoration, regardless of his current position. She also names him as the cottage's caretaker, with full rights to live there if he chooses. Victor's face had gone from red to white. This is preposterous. That property is meant for cemetery expansion. The board won't stand for this. The board, Richard said mildly, doesn't have a choice. The cottage and surrounding acre were Thomas's personal property, not cemetery land. Eleanor's will is quite clear. This isn't over, Victor hissed. Actually, it is, Margaret replied. Your services will no longer be required at Oakwood Cemetery, Mr. Chambers. The board will receive my recommendation for your termination tomorrow morning. Victor looked from Margaret to Richard to James, his eyes wild with fury. You'll regret this. All of you. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. In the silence that followed, James felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Thank you, he said finally. Margaret's expression remained stern. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Mercer. Victor Chambers has powerful friends. This isn't over. What do we do now? Sarah asked. James looked around the cottage, Eleanor's cottage, that was now his responsibility. We do what Eleanor wanted. We restore it. And we prepare for whatever Victor does next. Margaret nodded approvingly. My sister chose well. She turned to leave, then paused. The annual memorial service is next week. The board and all of Oakwood's most influential patrons will be there. Her eyes met James's. It would be the perfect time for Victor to make his move. Or the perfect time for us to make ours, James replied. The annual memorial service at Oakwood Cemetery drew the town's elite like moths to flame. Under a crisp autumn sky, James stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Victor Chambers work the crowd. Despite his pending termination, Victor moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, whispering to board members and patrons alike. He's rallying support, Richard murmured, appearing at James's side. 3 board members have already approached Margaret, questioning her decision. James nodded grimly. What's our next move? We wait, Richard replied. Victor will overplay his hand. Men like him always do. The memorial service proceeded with solemn dignity. When it concluded, Margaret Winters took the podium for closing remarks. As cemetery director, this was her moment, but before she could speak, Victor stepped forward. If I might address the gathering, he announced, not waiting for permission. There's an urgent matter concerning Oakwood's future. Margaret's face remained impassive as Victor launched into his speech about expansion plans and the unfortunate obstruction posed by the cottage restoration. He painted James as an opportunist, a mere gravedigger who had manipulated an elderly woman's sentiments. The question we must ask, Victor concluded, his voice ringing across the cemetery grounds, is whether we'll allow Oakwood's legacy to be compromised by one man's greed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. James felt his face burn, but Richard's hand on his arm kept him still. Now, Richard whispered. James stepped forward, carrying a weathered leather portfolio. Mr. Chambers speaks of legacy, he said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. I'd like to show you what Eleanor Winters' true legacy looks like. He opened the portfolio, revealing Eleanor's original sketches for the cottage garden, a sanctuary designed to complement the cemetery's peaceful purpose. As the drawings circulated, James explained Eleanor's vision, not an obstruction to Oakwood's growth, but an enhancement of its beauty and meaning. And there's something else you should see, James added, nodding to Sarah, who distributed copies of a document. These are records of cemetery land transactions over the past 5 years, showing how portions of Oakwood have been quietly sold to Chambers Development Corporation, Mr. Chambers' private company. Victor's face contorted. That's confidential information. Where did you get that? From me, said a voice from the back. An elderly man stepped forward, Harold Jenkins, the cemetery's former accountant. I kept copies of everything, Victor. I always suspected this day would come. The documents revealed what Victor had carefully concealed. His expansion plans weren't for the cemetery's benefit, but for a commercial development that would border the newly acquired land, dramatically increasing its value. "You've been selling Oakwood piece by piece," Margaret stated, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. "Using your position to enrich yourself at the expense of those we've laid to rest here." Victor's composure cracked. The cemetery was dying. "I was ensuring its financial future. By building a shopping center next to it?" Richard asked mildly. The board members exchanged glances. Victor looked around wildly, seeing support evaporate before his eyes. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted, but his voice had lost its authority. By sunset, Victor Chambers had resigned from the board. The legal consequences would follow, Richard assured James of that, but the immediate victory was the board's unanimous vote to proceed with the cottage restoration, with James as its architect. Later, as James stood alone by Eleanor's grave, he felt a bittersweet satisfaction. Victor had fallen by his own hand, undone by the very ambition that had driven him. Justice had been served, if imperfectly. The cottage would stand, but the wounds left by Victor's schemes would take time to heal. "We did it, Eleanor," he whispered to the quiet stone. "The cottage is safe now." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and for a moment, James could almost believe she had heard him. The autumn leaves crunched beneath James's boots as he made his way through Oakwood Cemetery, his morning rounds now infused with a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. 3 months had passed since Victor's resignation, and the transformation was palpable. The cottage restoration was well underway, its weathered bones gradually returning to life under his careful guidance. James paused at Eleanor's grave, placing a single white rose against her headstone. This had become his daily ritual, a quiet moment of gratitude before beginning work. The board had not only approved his plans but had created a new position for him, Preservation Director of Oakwood's Historical Structures. "You'd hardly recognize the place now, Eleanor," he murmured, smiling as he watched a family placing flowers at a nearby grave, their faces peaceful rather than hurried. As he turned toward the cottage, something caught his eye, a sleek black car parked near the cemetery's oldest section. A woman stood beside it, elegantly dressed and studying a map of the grounds. When she looked up, James was struck by her familiar features, the same high cheekbones and determined expression he'd seen in Eleanor's old photographs. She approached with purposeful steps. "Are you James? The gravedigger who saved my grandmother's cottage?" Before he could answer, she extended a gloved hand. "I'm Claire Winters. And I believe my grandmother left something for both of us to find." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel for more emotional narratives that explore family secrets and unexpected connections. Like this video and share your thoughts about what you think Eleanor might have left behind.